Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Okay, let's begin. Om Jnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana-salakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Sri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalan Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijanasahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishaka Anvitamscha Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Pristaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namne Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Desatarine Vanchakalpatarabhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyo Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratvishe Namaha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesa Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanusute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Reading from Śrīla Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta, Volume 1, Chapter 22, Part 2. Sam Speedstra, tall and slender with curly reddish golden hair, was athletic. He had trained as an Olympic skier, yet artistic. He was a writer and wood sculptor. He had graduated from Reed College in Oregon and gone on as a Fulbright scholar to a small college in Switzerland where he had obtained an MA in philosophy. He was popular as Mukunda saw him the epitome of a rugged individualist. When Mukunda had visited Sam at his mountain lookout tower and told him about Swamiji and Krishna consciousness, Sam had been intrigued by the new ideas. Sam's life had nearly reached a dead end, but he had seen hope in what Mukunda and Janaki had been saying about Swamiji. After spending over a few days with Mukunda, Sam had been eager to help him establish a temple of Krishna consciousness in San Francisco. Sam was the one who knew the local rock stars and had persuaded them to appear at the Avalon with Swami Bhaktivedanta, whom he had never met. Sam had seen Swamiji for the first time when Swamiji had arrived at San Francisco airport, and Sam had later insisted that he had seen a flash of light come from Swamiji's body. At first Sam had been afraid to say anything, nor had he known what to say. Prabhupada was completely new to him and seemed so elevated. But the day after the program at the Avalon, when Mukunda told Prabhupada that Sam had arranged the dance, Prabhupada sent for him to find out how much money they had made. Sitting across from Prabhupada, who sat behind his small desk, Sam informed him that they had made about $1,500 profit. Well then, Srila Prabhupada said, you will be the treasurer. Then Srila Prabhupada asked him, what is your idea of God? God is one, Sam replied. Prabhupada asked, what is the purpose of worshipping God? Sam replied, to become one with God. No, Prabhupada said, you cannot become one with God. God and you are always two different individuals. But you can become one in interest with him. And then he told Sam about Krishna. After they talked, Prabhupada said, you can come up every day and I will teach you how to do books. So Sam began meeting with Prabhupada for half an hour a day to learn bookkeeping. Sam, I had never been very good at keeping books, and I really didn't want to do it. but it was a good excuse to come and see Swamiji every day. He would chew me out when I would spend too much money or when I couldn't balance the books properly. I really loved the idea that he was so practical that he knew bookkeeping. He became so much more of a friend from the beginning rather than some idealized person from another sphere of life. I took almost all my practical questions to him. I learned to answer things for myself based on the way Swamiji always answered day-to-day problems. And the first thing he made me do was to get married to my girlfriend, Mukunda, and his wife Janaki, whose apartment was just down the hall from Srila Prabhupada, so were the only couple Srila Prabhupada had already initiated and married. Mukunda, who often wore his strand of large red japa beads in two loose loops around his neck, had grown long hair and a short, thick black beard since coming to San Francisco. He had entered the summer of love, spirit of hate, Ashbury, and was acquainted with many of the popular figures. Although occasionally earning money as a musician, he spent most of his time promoting Prabhupada's mission, especially by meeting people to arrange gala programs like the one at the Avalon. He was a leader in bringing people to assist Prabhupada, yet he had no permanent sense of commitment. He was helping because it was fun. Having little desire to do different from his many San Francisco friends, he did not strictly follow Prabhupada's principles for regulated spiritual life. In his exchanges with Srila Prabhupada, Mukunda liked to assume a posture of fraternal camaraderie rather than one of a menial servitude, and Srila Prabhupada reciprocated. Sometimes, however, Prabhupada would assert himself as the teacher. Once, when Prabhupada walked into Mukunda's apartment, he noticed a poster on the wall showing a matador with a cape and a sword going after a bull. This is a horrible picture, Srila Prabhupada exclaimed, his face showing displeasure. Mukunda looked at the poster, realizing for the first time what it meant. Yes, it is horrible, he said, and tore it off the wall. Srila Prabhupada was eager to have someone play the mridanga properly during the kirtan, and Mukunda, a musician, was likely candidate. Mukunda, the day the drum came, I asked Srila Swamiji if I could learn, and he said yes. I asked him when, and he said, "When do you want? Now?" I asked. He Now? I asked. He said yes. I was a little surprised to get such a quick appointment, but I brought the drum to his room and he began to show me the basic beats. First, there was a ghee tata, ghee tata, and then one slightly more complicated ghee tata, ghee tata, ghee ta. As I began to play the beat, I kept speeding it up and he kept telling me to slow down. He spent a lot of time just showing me how to strike the heads of the drum. Then I finally began to get it a little, but he had to keep admonishing me to slow down and pronounce the syllables as I hit the drum. Gi ta ta. The syllables, he said, and the drum should sound the same. I should make it sound like that and always pronounce them. I was determined and playing it very slowly for a long time. I was concentrating with a great intensity. Then suddenly I was aware of Swamiji standing motionless beside me. I didn't know how long he was going to stand there without saying anything, and I became a little uncomfortable. But I continued playing. When I got up the courage to look up and see his face, to my surprise, he was moving his head back and forth in an affirming way with his eyes closed. He seemed to be enjoying the lesson. This came as a complete surprise to me. Although I had taken music lessons before and had spent many years taking piano lessons, I can never remember an instance when the teacher seemed to actually enjoy my playing. I felt very wonderful to see that here was a teacher who was so perfect, who enjoyed what he was teaching so much, not because it was his personal teaching or his personal method, but because he was witnessing Krishna's energy pass through him to a conditioned soul like myself. And he was getting great pleasure out of it. I had a deeper realization that Swamiji was a real teacher, although I had no idea what a spiritual master really was. To Mukunda's wife, Janaki, Krishna consciousness meant dealing in a personal way with Swamiji. As long as he was around, she was all right. She enjoyed asking him questions, serving him, and learning from him how to cook. She didn't care much for studying the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, but she quickly developed an intense attraction for him. Janaki. There was a group of us sitting around in Swamiji's apartment, and I asked him if he had any children. He looked at me as if I had said something strange and he said, "You are not my child?" I said, "Well, yes." And he said, "Are you not all these are are not all these my children?" And his answer was so quick that I never doubted that he seriously meant what he said. For several hours each morning, Prabhupada showed Janaki, John, and others how to cook. One day in the kitchen, he noticed a kind of a berry he had never tasted, and he asked Janaki what they were. She told him strawberries. He immediately popped one into his mouth, saying, "That's very tasty," and he proceeded to eat another and another, exclaiming, "Very tasty." One time Janaki was making whipped cream when Prabhupada came into the kitchen and asked, "What's that?" She replied, "It's whipped cream." "What is whipped cream?" he asked. "It's cream," she replied, "but when you beat it, it fluffs up into a more solid form." Although always adamant about kitchen rules, one of the most important being that no one could eat in the kitchen, Srila Prabhupada immediately dipped his finger into the whipped cream and tasted it. "This is yogurt," he said. Um, In a light-hearted, reprimanding way that was her pleasure, Janaki replied, "No, Swamiji, it's whipped cream." Srila Prabhupada corrected her, "No, it is yogurt." And again he put his finger into it and tasted it and saying, "Oh, it tastes very nice." "Swamiji," Janaki accused him, "you are eating in the kitchen." Srila Prabhupada merely smiled and shook his head back and forth saying, "That is all right." Janaki, one time I told him, "Swamiji, I had the most exciting dream. We were all on a planet of our very own, and everybody from Earth had come there. They had all become pure devotees, and they were all chanting. You were sitting on a very special chair high off the ground, and the whole earth was clapping and chanting Hare Krishna." Swamiji smiled and said, "Oh, that's such a lovely dream." Bonnie MacDonald, age 19, and her boyfriend Gary McElroy, 20, had both come to San Francisco from Austin, where they had been living together as students at the University of Texas. Bonnie was a slight, fair blondie with a sweet southern drawl. She was born and raised in southeast Texas in a Baptist family. In high school, she had become agnostic, but later, while traveling in Europe and studying the religious art there and the architecture of the great cathedrals, she had concluded that these great artists couldn't have been completely wrong. Gary, the son of a U.S. Army Force officer, had been raised in Germany, Okinawa, and other places around the world before his family had settled in Texas. His dark hair and bushy brown brows gave him a scowling look, except when he smiled. He was one of the first students at University of Texas to wear long hair and experiment with psychedelic drugs. While taking LSD together, he and Bonnie had become obsessed with the idea of going on a spiritual search, and without notifying their parents or school, they had driven to the West Coast in search of someone who could teach us about spiritual life. They had spent a few frustrating months searching through spiritual books and amongst spiritual groups in Haight Ashbury. They had uh, become vegetarians. Gary had started teaching himself to play electric guitar while Bonnie had gone to Golden Gate Park every day to perform a self-styled Hatha Yoga meditation. But gradually had become disillusioned and had felt themselves becoming degraded from the drugs. When the disciple is ready, the guru will appear, they had read, and they had waited eagerly for the day when their guru would come. Although Bonnie had spent most of her time in the parks of San Francisco, one day she had been looking through a table full of magazines in a Het Ashbury head shop when she had found a copy of Back to Godhead, the mimeographed journal produced by Srila Prabhupada's disciple in New York. She had been particularly attracted to Haigriva's article about Swamiji. The descriptions of Swamiji's smile, his bright eyes, his pointy-toed shoes, and the things he said had given her a feeling that this might be the guru she has been looking for. And when she had learned that this same Swamiji had opened an ashram in Haight Ashbury, she had immediately started searching through the neighborhood until she had found the temple on Frederick Street. Before Bonnie and Gary met Swamiji, they had both been troubled. Gary was in anxiety about the threat of being drafted into the army, and both of them were disillusioned because they had not found the truth they had come to San Francisco to find. So, on meeting Srila Prabhupada in his room, they began to explain their situation. Boni. He was sitting in a rocking chair in his little apartment and he looked at us like we were crazy because we were and said, "You come to my classes, simply come to my classes every morning and every evening and everything will be all right." That sounded to us like an unbelievable panacea, but because we were so bewildered, we agreed to it. I told him I had traveled all over Europe, and he said, "Oh, you have traveled so much." And I said to him, "Yes, I have traveled so much, I have done so many things, but none of it ever made me happy." He was pleased with that statement. He said, "Yes, that is the problem." We began going into his morning lectures. For us, it was a long distance to get there at 7 in the morning, but we did it every morning with the conviction that this was what he had said to do, and we were going to do it. Then one day he asked us, "What do you do?" When we said that formerly we had been art students at college, he told us to paint pictures of Krishna. Shortly after that, we asked to be initiated. Joan and Roger were soon initiated, receiving the names Yamuna and Gurudas, and the very next day they were married. At their wedding ceremony, Swamiji preceded wearing a bulky garland of leaves and rhododendron flowers. He sat on a cushion on the temple floor, surrounded by his followers and paraphernalia for sacrificial fire. Before him was a small mold of earth where he would later build the fire. He explained the meaning of Krishna conscious marriage and how husband and wife should assist one another and serve Krishna, keeping him in the center. Swamiji had commented that he did not like the Western woman's dress, and at his request, Yamuna was dressed in a sari. Although Swamiji had called for ghee, clarified butter, as one of the sacrificial ingredients, the devotees, thinking ghee too costly, had substituted melted margarine. He had called for firewood also, and the devotees had supplied him the bits of a broken orange crate. Now, with Yamuna and Gurudas seated before him on the opposite side of the mound of earth, he picked up a small piece of splintered orange crate, dipped it into what was supposed to be ghee, and held it in the candle flame to begin the fire. The splitted flame spluttered and went out. He picked up another splinter and moistened it in the melted margarine, but when he touched it to the flame, it made the same spit sound and splattered out. After trying unsuccessfully 4 or 5 times, Swamiji looked up and said, "This marriage will have a very slow start." Yamuna began to cry. Boni and Gary were initiated just 2 weeks after they had met Swamiji. Boni's initiated name was Govinda Dasi and Gary's was Gaurasundara. Although still dressed in blue jeans even at their initiation and not professing to know much of what was going on, they had confidence in Swamiji. They knew that their minds were still hazy from drugs, but they took their initiation seriously and became strict followers. Gaurasundara threw out whatever marijuana he had, and he and Govinda Dasi began eating only foods they had offered to Lord Krishna. 2 weeks after their initiation, Swamiji conducted their marriage ceremony. On the evening of wedding, Govinda Dasi's father came from Texas, even though he objected to Krishna consciousness as radically un-American. Walking up to Srila Prabhupada's seat in the temple, Govinda Das's father asked, "Why do you have to change my daughter's name? Why does she have to have a Indian name?" Prabhupada looked at him and then, with a mischievous gleam, looked at Mr. Patel, an Indian guest standing nearby with his family. "You don't like Indians?" he asked. Everyone who heard Swamiji laughed, except for Govinda Das's father, who replied, "Well, yeah, they are all right, but why does Boni have to have a different name?" "Because she has asked me to give her one," Srila Prabhupada replied. "If you love her, you will like what she likes. Your daughter is happy. Why do you object?" The discussion ended there, and Govinda Das's father remained civil. Later, he enjoyed taking prasadam with his daughter and son-in-law. Govinda Dasi. Gaurasundara and I set about reading the 3 volumes of Swamiji's Srimad Bhagavatam, and at the same time, Swamiji had told me to paint a large canvas of Radha and Krishna and a cow. So every day, for a whole day, I would paint, and Gaurasundara would read out loud from the Srimad Bhagavatam. one volume after another. We did this continuously for 2 months. During this time, Swamiji also asked me to do a portrait of him standing before a background painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing. Swamiji wanted it so that Lord Chaitanya's foot would be touching his head. I tried, it was pretty horrible painting, and yet he was happy with it. Prabhupada's thoughtful followers felt that some of the candidates for initiation did not intend to fulfill the exclusive lifelong commitment a disciple owes to his guru. Swamiji, they would say, some of these people come only for their initiation. We have never seen them before and we never seen them again. Srila Prabhupada replied that that was the risk he had to take. One day in a lecture in the temple, he explained that although the reactions for a disciple's past sins are removed at initiation, the spiritual master remains responsible until the disciple is delivered from the material world. Therefore, he said, Lord Chaitanya warned that a guru should not accept many disciples. One night in the temple during the question and answer session, a big bearded fellow raised his hand and asked Prabhupada, can I become initiated? The brash public request annoyed some of the Prabhupada's followers, but Prabhupada was serene. Yes, he replied, but first you must answer two questions. Who is Krishna? The boy thought for a moment and said, Krishna is God. Yes, Prabhupada replied. And who are you? Again the boy thought for a few moments and then replied, I am the servant of God. Very good. Prabhupada said, yes, you can be initiated tomorrow. Srila Prabhupada knew that it would be difficult for his Western disciples to stick to Krishna consciousness and attain the goal of pure devotional service. All their lives they had had the worst of training, and despite their nominal Christianity and philosophical searching, most of them knew nothing of the science of God. They did not even know that illicit sex and meat eating were wrong, although when he told them they accepted what he said, and they freely chanted Hare Krishna, so how could he refuse them? Of course, whether they would be able to in persevere in Krishna consciousness despite the ever-present attraction of Maya would be seen in time. Some would fall, that was the human tendency, but some would not. At least those who sincerely followed his instructions to chant Hare Krishna and avoid sinful activities would be successful. He gave the example that a person could say that today's fresh food, if not properly used, would spoil in a few days. But if it is fresh now, to say that in the future it will be misused and therefore spoil is only a surmise. Yes, in the future anyone would fall down, but Prabhupada took it as his responsibility to engage his disciples now. And he was giving them the methods which, if followed, would protect them from ever falling down. Aside from Vedic standards, even by the standard of Swamiji's New York's disciples, the devotees in San Francisco were not very strict. Some continued going to the donut shop, eating food without offering it to Krishna, and eating forbidden things like chocolates and commercial ice cream. Some even indulged in after kirtan cigarette breaks right outside the temple door. Some got initiated without knowing precisely what they had agreed to practice. Kirtanananda, the mood in San Francisco was a lot more relaxed. The devotees liked to go to the corner and have their coffee and donuts. But Prabhupada loved the way so many people were coming, and he loved the program at the Avalon Ballroom. But there were two sides, those who strictly followed the rules and regulations and emphasized purity, and then those who were not so concerned about strictness but who wanted to spread Krishna consciousness as widely as possible. Swamiji was Swamiji was so great that he embraced both groups. Michael Wright, 21, had recently gotten out of a Marine Corps, and Nancy Grindle, 18, was fresh out of high school. They had met in college in Los Angeles, feeling frustrated and in need of something tangible to which to dedicate their lives. They had come to San Francisco to join the hippies. But they soon realized that they and the Haight Ashbury hippies, whom they found dirty, aimless, unproductive, and lost in their search for identity, had little in common. So Nancy took a job as a secretary for a telephone company, and Michael found work at a lineman for electric company. Then they heard about the Swami in Haight Ashbury and decided to visit the temple. It was an evening kirtan and irrepressible hippies were twirling, twisting, and wingling. Michael and Nancy took a seat on the floor off to one side, impressed more by the presence of the Swami than by the kirtan. After the kirtan, Prabhupada lectured, but they found his accent heavy. They wanted to understand. They had an innate feeling that he was saying something valuable, and yet the secret seemed locked behind a thick accent and within a book written in another language. They decided to come back in the morning and try again. At the morning program, they found a smaller group, a dozen devotees with beads for chanting draped around their necks, a few street people. The kirtan seemed sweeter and more mellow, and Michael and Nancy chanted and danced along with the devotees. Then Prabhupada spoke, and this time they caught a few of his ideas. They stayed for breakfast and became friends with Mukunda and Janaki, Sam and Marjorie, now Shyamasundara and Malati, Yamuna and Gurudas, and Govindadasi and Gaurasundara. They liked the devotees and promised to come again that evening. Soon they were regularly attending the morning and evening programs, and Nancy, all along with other women, was attending Prabhupada's weekend cooking classes. Michael was open to Prabhupada's ideas, but he had difficulty accepting the necessity of surrendering to a spiritual authority. His tendency was to reject authorities, but the more he thought about it, the more he saw that Prabhupada was right. He had to accept an authority. He reasoned, every time I stop at a red light, I am accepting an authority. And finally, he concluded that to progress in spiritual understanding, he would have to accept a spiritual authority. Yet, because he didn't want to accept it, he was in a dilemma. Finally, after hearing Prabhupada's lecture for 2 weeks, Mishael decided to surrender to Prabhupada's authority and try to become Krishna conscious. Michael, Nancy and I decided to get married and become Swamiji's disciples and members of his society. We told some of the devotees we would like to see Swamiji. They said, yes, just go up. He's on the third floor. We were a little surprised that there were no formalities required, and when we got to the door, his servant Ranchor let us in. We went in with our shoes on, so Ranchor had to ask us to take them off. I didn't know exactly what to say to Swamiji. I was depending on my future wife to make the initial opening, but then I finally said, we came because we would like to become member of your Krishna Conscious Society. He said this was very nice. Then I said that actually the main reason we were there was that we wanted to be married. We knew that he performed marriage ceremonies and that it was a part of the society's requirements that couples had to be duly married before they could live together. Swamiji asked me if I liked the philosophy and I had a job. My answer to both questions was yes. He explained that first of all we would have to be initiated and then we would be married the next month. At their initiation, Mishael received the name Dayananda and Nancy received the name Nandarani. Soon Prabhupada performed their marriage. Nandarani. We knew it would be a very big wedding. In Haight Ashbury, whenever Swamiji would perform a wedding, hundreds of people would come and the temple would be filled. My parents were coming and Dayanand's parents were also coming. Swamiji said that it was proper that I cook. He said I should come to his apartment on the morning of the wedding and he would help me cook something for the wedding feast. So that morning I put on my best jeans and my best sweatshirt and my boots and I went off to Swamiji's apartment. When I got upstairs, I walked in with my boots on. Swamiji was sitting there in his rocking chair. He smiled at me and said, "Oh, you have come to cook?" I said, "Yes." He sat there and looked at me, one of those long, silent stares. He said, "First, take off the boots." After I took off my boots and my old leather jacket, Swamiji got up and went into the kitchen. He got a very large pot that had been burned so thick, on the bottom that practically there was no metal visible. He handed it to me and said, "We want to boil milk in this pot. It has to be washed." There wasn't a sink in Swamiji's kitchen, only a teeny round basin. So I went into the bathroom, put the pot in the bathtub, and rinsed it out. I assumed Swamiji didn't want the black off the bottom because it was burned on. So I brought it back to him and he said, "Oh, that is very clean, but just take off this little black on the bottom here." I said okay and got a knife and crawled into the bathtub and started scrubbing the black off. I worked and worked and worked and I scrubbed and scrubbed. I had cleanser up to my elbows and I made a mess everywhere. I had gotten about half the black off. The rest seemed to be more or less an integral part of the bottom. So I took the pot back to the Swamiji and said, "This is the best I can do. All of this is burned on." He said, "Yes, yes, you have done a wonderful job. Now just take off this black that's left." So I went back into the bathtub and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. It was almost midday when I came out of the bathtub with all the black scrubbed off the bottom of that pot. He was so happy when I brought the pot in. It was sparkling. A big smile came on his face and he said, "Oh, this is perfect." I was exhausted. Then Swamiji welcomed me into his kitchen and taught me how to make rasagullas. We boiled the milk, curdled it, and then I sat down and began rolling the curd into balls on a tray. As I rolled the balls, I would put them in a little row along the tray, and every single ball had to be exactly the same size. Swamiji would take his thumb and first and second finger and shoot the ball out of the row when they weren't the right size, and I would have to remake them until were right size. This went on until I had a full tray of balls all the same size. Then Swamiji showed me how to boil the balls of curd in sugar water. Malati, Janaki, and I were cooking in the kitchen, and Swamiji was singing. At one point, Swamiji stopped singing and asked me, "Do you know what your name means?" I couldn't even remember what my name was. He had told me at initiation, but because none of us used our devotees' names, I couldn't remember what my name was. I said, "No, Swamiji, what does my name mean?" He said, "It means you are the mother of Krishna." And he laughed loudly and went back to stirring the rasgullas. I couldn't understand who Krishna was, who is the world, who in the world his mother would be, or how I was in any way related to her. But I was satisfied that Swamiji felt that I was somebody worth being. I finished cooking that afternoon about 4 o'clock and then I went home to get dressed for the wedding. Although I had never worn anything but old dresses and jeans, Swamiji had suggested to the other ladies that they find a way to put me into a sari for the wedding. So we bought a piece of silk to use for a sari. I went to Malati's house. She was going to try to help me put it on. I couldn't keep it on, so she had to sew it on me. Then they decorated me with flowers and took me to Swamiji and showed him. He was very happy. He said, "This is the way our women should always look. No more jeans and dresses. They should always wear saris." Actually, I looked a fright. I kept stumbling and they had to sew the cloth on me. But Swamiji thought it was wonderful. The cloth was all one color, so Swamiji said, "Next time you should buy cloth that has a little border on the bottom, so it's two colors. I like two colors better." When we went downstairs to the wedding, Swamiji met my relatives. He spoke to them very politely. My mother cried a lot during the ceremony. I was very satisfied that she had been blessed by meeting Swamiji. Steve Bohlet, age 20, born and raised in New York and now living the hippie life in San Francisco, had read in the oracle about Swami Bhaktivedanta's coming to San Francisco. The idea of meeting an Indian Swami had interested him, and responding to a notice he had seen posted on Haight Street, he had gone along the Caroline Gold, the woman he was living with, to the airport to meet Swami Bhaktivedanta. He and Caroline had both gotten a blissful lift by chanting Hare Krishna and seeing Prabhupada, and they began regularly attending the lectures and kirtanas at the temple. Steve decided he wanted to become like the Swami, so he and Caroline went together to see Prabhupada and request initiation. Speaking privately with Prabhupada in his room, they discussed obedience to the spiritual master and becoming vegetarian. When Prabhupada told them that they should either stop living together or get married, they said they would like to get married. An initiation date was set. Prabhupada asked Steve to shave his long hair and beard. Why do you want me to shave my head? Steve protested. Krishna had long hair, Ram had long hair, Lord Chaitanya had long hair, and Krishna had long hair. Why should I shave my head? Prabhupada smiled and replied, because now you are following me. There was a print on the wall of Suradas a Vaishnav. You should shave your head like that, Prabhupada said, pointing to Suradas. I don't think I am ready to do that yet, Steve said. All right, you are still a young man. There is still time, but at least you should shave your face clean and cut your hair like a man. On the morning of the initiation, Steve shaved off his beard and cut off his hair around his ears so that it was short in front but long in the back. How's this? He asked. You should cut the back also, Prabhupada replied. Steve agreed. To Steve, Prabhupada gave the name Subala and to Caroline the name Krishna Devi. A few days later, he performed their wedding. Krishna Desi, sorry, Krishna Devi. A few days later, he performed their wedding. Since each ceremony was another occasion for kirtan and prasadam distribution, onlookers became attracted. And as the spiritual names and married couples increased with each ceremony, Prabhupada's spiritual family grew. The harmonious atmosphere was like that of a small, loving family, and Prabhupada dealt with his disciples intimately without the formalities of an institution or hierarchy. Disciples would approach him for various reasons, entering the little apartment to be alone with him as he sat on a mat before his makeshift desk in the morning sunlight. With men like Mukunda Gurudas, Shyama Sundara Swamiji was a friend. With Janaki and Govinda Devi, he was sometimes ready to be chided, almost like their naughty son, or he would be their grandfatherly teacher of cooking, the enforcer of rules of kitchen cleanliness. And to all of them, he was the unfathomable, pure devotee of Lord Krishna, who knew the conclusions of all the Vedic scriptures and who knew beyond all doubts the truth of transmigration. He could answer all questions. He could lead them beyond material life, beyond Hate, Ashbury, hippiedom, and into spiritual world with Krishna. It was 7 p.m. Srila Prabhupada entered the temple dressed in a saffron dhoti, an old turtleneck jersey under a cardigan sweater and a chadar around his shoulders. Walking to the dais in the rear of the room, he took his seat. The dais, a cushion atop a redwood plank 2 feet off the floor, was supported between two redwood columns. In front of the dais stood a cloth-covered lectern with a bucket of cut flowers on either side. Covering the wall behind the dais was a typical Indian madras with Haridas' crude painting of Lord Chaitanya in Kirtan hanging against it. Srila Prabhupada picked up his kartals, wrapped the cloth straps around his forefingers, and looked out at his young followers sitting cross-legged on burgundy rug. The men were bearded, and almost everyone wore long hair, beads, exotic clothing, and trinkets. The bulbs hanging from the ceiling diffused their light through Japanese paper lanterns, and Navajo god's eye symbols dangled from strings. Prabhupada began the ringing 1 2 3 rhythm, and Shamsundar began pumping the harmonium. Although the harmonium was a simple instrument, a miniature piano keyboard to be played with the right hand and bellows to be pumped with the left hand, no one in the Frederick Street storefront knew how to play it, so it became simply the drone. Another important kirtan instrument, the two-headed mridanga from India, was meant for intricate rhythmic accompaniments, but even Mukunda could play it only very simply, matching the 1 2 3 of Prabhupada's kartals. There were other instruments on hand, a kettle drum, the pride of the temple, Haigriva's old cornet, a few conch shells, and a horn Haigriva had made by shellacking a piece of kelp he had found on the beach. Some guests had brought their own flutes, pipes, and bongos, but for now they let their instruments remain still and clapped to Prabhupada's rhythm as he sang the evening prayers. Prabhupada's Sanskrit hymn praised the Vaishnava spiritual masters. For each great devotee in the disciplic succession, he sang a specific prayer. First, he chanted the poetic description of the transcendental qualities of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. Then, Gaurakishore Das Babaji, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, one after another. One prayer described Srila Bhakti Siddhanta as the deliverer of the fallen souls, and another praised Gaurakishore Das Babaji as renunciation personified, always merged in the feeling of separation and intense love for Krishna. Srila Prabhupada sang of Lord Chaitanya, the golden complexioned Supreme Personality of Godhead who distributed pure love of Krishna. And he sang of Lord Krishna, the ocean of mercy, the friend of the distressed, the source of creation. As Prabhupada became absorbed in the bhajan, his body trembled with ecstatic emotion. The group on the floor sat swaying from side to side, watching him, his eyes closed in meditation, his delicate, practiced fingers expertly playing the cymbals. They heard the heartfelt minor moods and the tones of his voice, unlike anything they had heard before. Then he began the familiar mantra they had come to hear, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, and immediately they joined him. The horns and drums sounded, and soon all other instruments players joined in. Gradually, a few at a time, members of audience rose to their feet and began to dance. Prabhupada's followers stood and began stepping from side to side as he had shown them, sometimes raising their hands in the air. Others moved as they pleased, occasionally opening his eyes and glancing around. Prabhupada sat firmly, chanting though his head and body were trembling. After 20 minutes, many of the young dancers were leaping, jumping, and perspiring as Prabhupada continued to sing, leading the dancers by the beat of his kartals. His eyes were closed, yet he controlled the entire wild congregation, playing his kartal loudly. The chanting and dancing continued, and Prabhupada approved. The kirtan of these hippies was different from the chanting of Indian Brahmanas, but Prabhupada didn't mind. His standard was devotion. In his Radha Krishna temple, wherever he accepted, Krishna accepted. This was his offering to Krishna through his spiritual master Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. Prabhupada was absolutely confident. Even if his young devotees didn't know how to play the harmonium, keyboard, or mridanga, even if they didn't know that congregational kirtan should be done not in constant unison as they were doing, but responsively, and even if they didn't know how to honor the Guru, still because they were chanting and dancing, he encouraged them and nodded to them. Yes, wild elements were there, of course. People whose mind and intention were far away in some chemically induced fantasy, yet the mood was dominated by Prabhupada's followers, who danced with arms upraised and watched their leader carefully. Although in many ways they were still like hippies, they were Swamiji's disciples and they wanted to please him and follow his instructions. They wanted to attain Krishna consciousness. For all the varied punctuation of horn and to timpani, the kirtan remained sweet. Hayagriva even played his cornet in tune and only during every other mantra. Srila Prabhupada knew that some aspects of Kirtan were wrong or below standard, but he accepted the offering and not awkwardly but lovingly. He simply wanted these American boys and girls to chant. That they dressed irregularly, jumped too savagely, or have the wrong philosophy did not over concern him. These boys and girls were chanting Hare Krishna, so at least for the present, they were pure. The hippies knew that too, and they loved it. Just as in Janaki's dream, Srila Prabhupada's pleasure was to see the whole world engaged in Kirtan. Somehow or other, he would say, people should be engaged in Krishna consciousness. And this was the instruction of Lord Chaitanya's chief follower, Rupa Goswami, who had written Tasmat Kenapi Upayena Manah Krishne Nivesayet. Somehow or other, fix the mind on Krishna. The rules and regulations can come later. Inherent in this attitude of Srila Prabhupada and Srila Rupa Goswami was a strong conviction about the purifying force of the holy name. If engaged in chanting Hare Krishna, even the most fallen person could gradually become a saintly person. Srila Prabhupada would often quote a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam affirming that persons addicted to sinful acts could be purified by taking shelter of the devotees of the Lord. He knew that every Haight Ashbury hippie was eligible to receive the mercy of the holy name, and he saw it as his duty to his spiritual master to distribute the gift of Krishna consciousness freely, rejecting no one. Yet, while living amongst these mlechas, he required a certain standard of behavior, and he was adamant about preserving the purity of his Krishna consciousness society. For example, if he were going to distribute free food to the public, it could not be ordinary food but must be prasadam, food offered to Krishna. Feeding hungry people was futile unless they were given prasadam and the chants of liberation from birth and death. And although in the Kirtanas he allowed openness and free expression and welcomed the wildest participation, the transcendental sound of the holy name had to dominate. He never allowed the Kirtan to degenerate into mere beating on drums or chanting of any other words, nor could anyone in the group become so crazy that others wouldn't be able to hear or take part in the congregational chanting. In his attempts to somehow or other get these young people chant Hare Krishna, Prabhupada instinctively knew what to allow and what not to allow. He was the master, and his new disciples followed him when he permitted an egoistic, sensual dancer to jump around the temple or a madman to argue with him in a question and answer period. When a person was too disruptive, Prabhupada was not afraid to stop him, but stopping was rare. The main thing was giving. The kirtan lasted more than an hour as the chanters joined the hands and danced around the room and incense poured out the front door. The more the morning and evening kirtans had already made the Radha Krishna temple popular in Haight Ashbury, but when the devotees began serving a daily free lunch, the temple became an integral part of the community. Prabhupada told his disciples simply to cook and distribute prasadam. That would be their only activity during the day. In the morning they would cook, and at the noon they would feed everyone who came. Sometimes 150 or to 200 hippies from the streets of Haight Ashbury. Before the morning kirtan, the girls would put oatmeals on the stove, and by breakfast there would be a room full of hippies, most of whom had been up all the night. The cereal and fruit was for some the first solid foods in day. But the main program was the lunch. Malati would go out and shop, getting donations whenever possible for whole wheat flour, garbanzo flour, split peas, rice, and whatever vegetables were cheap or free. Potatoes, carrots, turpins, rutabagas, beets. Then every day the cooks would prepare spiced mashed potatoes, buttered chapatis, split peas, dal, and a vegetable dish for 200 people. The lunch program was possible because many merchants were willing to donate to the recognized cause of feeding hippies. Harsharani. The lunch program attracted a lot of hippies hill crowd who obviously wanted food. They were really hungry, and there were other people who would come also. People who were working with the temple but weren't initiated. The record player would be playing the Swamiji's record. It was a nice family atmosphere. Haridas. It was taken outside the front, but the main food was served inside. It was amazing. The people would just all huddle together and we would really line them wall to wall. A lot of them would simply eat and leave. Other stores along Heath Ashberries were selling everything from beads to rock records, but our store was different because we weren't selling anything, we were giving it away, and we were welcoming everybody. We were providing a kind of refuge from the tumult and madness of the scene. So it was that sense a hospital, and I think a lot of people were helped and maybe even saved. I don't mean only their souls, I mean their minds and bodies were saved because of what was going on in the streets that they just simply couldn't handle. I am talking about overdoses of drugs, people who were plain lost and needed comforting, and who sort of wandered or staggered into the temple. Some of them stayed and became devotees, and some just took prasadam and left. Daily, we had unusual incidents, and Swamiji witnessed it and took part in it. The lunch program was his idea. Mukunda. The Salvation Army came in one day for lunch. They just unloaded a whole truckload of people on us, about 30 or 40. Larry Shippen, some of the community of loose people cynically took advantage of free food. They didn't appreciate the Swami because they said he was, in his own way, an orthodox minister and they were much more interested in being unorthodox. It was a fairly cynical thing. Those who were more interested and had questions, the spiritual seekers, would visit Swamiji in his room. Many of them would come in complete anxiety over the war in Vietnam or whatever was going on, trouble with the law, bad experiences on drug, a falling out with the school or family. There was much public concern about the huge influx of youth in San Francisco, a situation that was creating an almost uncontrollable social problem. Police and social welfare workers were worried about health problems and poor living conditions, especially in Haight Ashbury. Some middle class people feared a complete hippie takeover. The local authorities welcomed the service offered by Swami Bhaktivedanta's temple, and when civic leaders in Haight Ashbury talked of forming a council to deal with crisis, they requested Swami Bhaktivedanta to take part. He agreed but lost interest after the first meeting. No one seemed seriously interested in hearing his solution. Master Subramania. A lot of responsible citizens in San Francisco were very happy that Swami Bhaktivedanta was working amongst the young people. The young people at that time were searching and needed somebody of a very high caliber who would take an interest in them and who would say, you should do this and you should not do that. The consensus was that no one could tell the young people what to do because they were completely out of hand with drugs and so forth. But Swamiji told them what to do and they did it. And everyone was appreciative, especially the young people. Harsha Rani, just from a medical standpoint, doctors didn't know what to do with the people on LSD. The police and the free clinics in the area couldn't handle the overload of people taking LSD. The police saw Swamiji as a certain refuge. Michael Bowen, Bhaktivedanta had an amazing ability through devotion to to get people off drugs, especially speed, heroin, burnout, LSD cases, all of that. Haridas. The police used to come with their paddy wagons through the park in the early hours of the morning and pick up runaway teenagers sleeping in the park. The police would round them up and try to send them back home. Thus, hippies needed all the help they could get, and they knew it. And Radhakrishna Temple was certainly a kind of spiritual heaven. Kids sensed it. They were running, living on streets, no place where they could go, where they could rest, where people them, weren't going to hurt them. A lot of kids would literally fall into the temple. I think it saved a lot of lives. There might have been a lot more casualties if it hadn't been for Krishna, Hare Krishna. It was like opening a temple in a battlefield. It was the hardest place to do it, but it was the place where it was most needed. Although the Swami had no precedents for dealing with any of this, he applied the chanting with miraculous results. The chanting was wonderful. It worked. Srila Prabhupada knew that only Krishna consciousness could help. Others had their remedies, but Prabhupada considered them mere patchwork. He knew that ignorantly identifying the self with the body was the real cause of suffering. How could someone help himself, what to speak of others, if he didn't know who he was? If he didn't know the body was only a covering of real self, the spiritual spirit soul, which could be happy only in his original nature as an eternal servant of Krishna. Understanding that Lord Krishna considered anyone who approached him a virtuous person and that even a little devotional service would never be lost and could save a person at the time of death. Srila Prabhupada had opened his door to everyone, even the most abject runaway. But for a lost soul to fully receive the balm of Krishna consciousness, he would first have to stay a while and chant, inquire, listen, and follow. As Allen Ginsberg had advised 5,000 hippies at Avalon, uh, the early morning kirtan at the temple provided a vital community service for those who were coming down from LSD and wanted to stabilize their consciousness on re-entry. Alan himself sometimes dropped by in the morning with acquaintance with whom he had stayed up all night. Allen Ginsberg. At 63 in the morning, we went out to Swami Bhaktivedanta's space station for some chanting and a little Krishna consciousness. There were about 30 or 40 people there, all chanting Hare Krishna to their new tune they have made up just for the mornings. One kid got a little freaked out by sense scene at first, but then he relaxed and afterwards he told me, at first I thought, what is this? But then suddenly I realized that I was just not grooving with where I was. I wasn't being where I was. On occasion, the re-entries would come flying in out of control for crash landing in the middle of the night. One morning at 2 a.m., the boys sleeping in the storefront were awakened by a pounding at the door, screaming, and police lights. When they opened the door, a young hippie with wild red hair and beard plunged in, crying, "Oh Krishna, Krishna, oh help me, oh, don't let them get me, oh, for God's sake, help." A policeman stuck his head in the door and smiled. "We decided to bring him by here," he said, "because we thought maybe you guys could help him." "I'm not comfortable in this body," the boy screamed as policeman shut the door. The boy began chanting furiously and turned white, sweating profusely in tears. Swamiji's boys spent the rest of the early morning consoling him and chanting with him until the Swami came down for kirtan and class. The devotees often sent distressed young people to Prabhupada with their problems, and they allowed almost anyone to see Swamiji and take up his valuable time. While walking around San Francisco, Ravindra Swarup once met a man who claimed to have seen people from Mars in his tent when he had been stationed in Vietnam. The man, who had just been discharged from an army hospital, said that the Martian had talked to him. Ravindra Swarup told him about Swamiji's book Easy Journey to Other Planets, which verified the idea of life on other planets, and he suggested that Swami could probably tell him more about the people from Mars. So the man visited the Swami up in his apartment. "Yes," Swamiji answered, "there are Martians." Gradually, Prabhupada's followers became more considerate of their spiritual master and began protecting him from persons they thought might be undesirable. One such undesirable was a rabbit, perhaps the dirtiest hippie in Haight Ashbury. Rabbit's hair was always dishevelled, dirty, and even filled with lice. His clothes were ragged and filthy, and his dirt-caked body stank. He wanted to meet Prabhupada, but the devotees refused, not wanting to defile Prabhupada's room with Rabbit's nasty, stinking presence. One night after lecture, however, Rabbit waited outside the temple door. As Prabhupada approached, Rabbit asked, "May I come up and see you?" Prabhupada agreed. As for challenges, almost every night someone would come to argue with Prabhupada. One man came regularly with prepared arguments from a philosophy book from which he would read aloud. Prabhupada would defeat him, and the man would go home, prepare another argument, and come back again with his book. One night after the man had presented his challenge, Prabhupada simply looked at him without bothering to reply. Prabhupada's neglect was another defeat for the man, who got up and left. Israel, like Rabbit, was another well-known Haight-Ashbury character. He had a long ponytail and often played the trumpet during kirtan. After one of Prabhupada's evening lectures, Israel challenged, "This chanting may be nice, but what will it do for the world? What will it do for the humanity?" Prabhupada replied, "Are you not in the world? If you like it, why will others not like it? So you chant loudly." The mustached man standing at the back of the room asked, "Are you Allen Ginsberg's guru?" Many of the devotees knew that the question was loaded and that to answer either yes or no would be difficult. Srila Prabhupada replied, "I am nobody's guru. I am everybody's servant." To the devotees, the whole exchange became transcendental due to Swamiji's reply. Swamiji had not simply given a clever response, he had answered out of deep, natural humility. One morning, a couple attended the lecture, a woman carrying a child and a man wearing a backpack. During the question and answer period, the man asked, "What about my mind?" Prabhupada gave him philosophical replies, but the man kept repeating, "What about my mind? What about my mind?" With a pleading, compassionate look, Prabhupada said, "I have no other medicine. Please chant this Hare Krishna. I have no other explanation. I have no other answer." But the man kept talking about his mind. Finally, one of the women devotees interrupted and said, "Just do what he says. Just try it." And Prabhupada picked up his kartal and began kirtan. One evening, a boy burst into a lecture exclaiming that riot was gathering ahead on Hate Street. The Swami should come immediately, address the crowd, and calm everyone down. Mukunda explained that it wasn't necessary for Swamiji to go, others could help. The boy just stared at Prabhupada as if giving an ultimatum: unless Swamiji came immediately, there would be a riot, and Swamiji would be to blame. Prabhupada spoke as if preparing to do what the boy wanted. "Yes, I am prepared." But nobody went and there were no riot. Usually during Kirtan, at least one dancer would carry on in a narcissistic, egoistic way, occasionally becoming lured to the point where Prabhupada would ask the person to stop. One evening, before Srila Prabhupada had come down from his apartment, a girl in a mini-skirt began writhing and gyrating in the temple during Kirtan. When one of the devotees went upstairs and told Prabhupada, he replied, "That's all right. Let her use her energy for Krishna. I am coming soon. I will see for myself." When Prabhupada arrived and started another Kirtan, the girl who was very skinny again began to wriggle and gyrat. Prabhupada opened his eyes and saw her. He frowned and glanced at one of his disciples, indicating his displeasure. Taking the girl aside, one of the women escorted her out. A few minutes later, the girl returned, wearing slacks and dancing in a more reserved style. Prabhupada was sitting on his dais lecturing to a full house when a fat girl who had been sitting on the window seat suddenly stood up and began hollering at him. "Are you just going to sit there?" she yelled. "What are you going to do now? Come on, aren't you going to say something? What are you going to do? Who are you?" Her action was so sudden and her speech so violent that no one in the temple responded. Unangered, Prabhupada sat very quietly. He appeared hurt. Only the devotees sitting closest to him heard him say softly, as if it as if to himself, "It is the darkest of the darkness." Another night, while Prabhupada was lecturing, a boy came up and sat on the dais beside him. The boy faced out toward the audience and interrupted Prabhupada. "I would like to say something now," Prabhupada politely said. "Wait until after the class. Then we have questions." The boy waited for a few minutes, still sitting on the dais, and Prabhupada continued to lecture, but again the boy interrupted. "I got something to say. I want to say what I have to say now." The devotees in the audience looked up, astonished, thinking that Swamiji would handle the matter and not wanting to cause a disturbance. None of them did anything. They simply sat while the boy began talking incoherently. Then Prabhupada picked up his kartal. "All right, let us have kirtan." The boy sat in the same place throughout the kirtan, looking crazily, sometimes menacingly at Prabhupada. After half an hour, the kirtan stopped. Prabhupada cut an apple into small pieces, was his custom. As was his custom, he then placed the paring knife and a piece of apple in his right hand and held his hand out to the boy. The boy looked at Prabhupada, then down at the apple and knife. The room became silent. Prabhupada sat motionless, smiling slightly at the boy. After a long, tense moment, the boy reached out. A sigh rose from the audience as the boy chose the piece of an apple from Prabhupada's open hand. Haridas, I used to watch how Swamiji would handle things. It wasn't easy. To me, that was a real test of his powers and understanding. How to handle these people, not to alienate or antagonize or stir them up to create more trouble. He would turn their energy so that before they knew it, they were calm, like when you pat a baby and it stops crying. Swamiji had a way of doing that with words, with the intonation of his voice, with his patience to let them carry on for a certain period of time. Let them work it out, act it out even. I guess he realized that the devotees just couldn't say, listen, when you come to temple, you can't behave this way. It was a delicate situation there. Often someone would say, I am God. They would get an insight or hallucination from their drugs. They would try to steal the spotlight. They wanted to be heard, and you could feel an anger against the Swamiji from people like that. Sometimes they would speak inspired and poetic for a while, but they couldn't sustain it, and their speech would become gibberish. And the Swami was not one to simply pacify people. He wasn't going to coddle them. He would say, what do you mean? If you are God, then you have to be all knowing. You have to have the attributes of God. Are you omniscient and omnipotent? He would then name all the characteristics that one would have to be an avatar, to be God. He would rationally prove the person wrong. He had superior knowledge, and he would rationally explain to them, if you are God, can you do this? Do you have this power? Sometimes people would take it as a challenge and would try to have a verbal battle with the Swami. The audience attention would then swing to the disturbing individual, the person who was grabbing the spotlight. Sometimes it was very difficult. I used to sit there and wonder, how is he going to handle this guy? This one is really a problem. But Swamiji was hard to defeat. Even if he couldn't convince the person, he convinced the other people in the crowd so that the energy of the room would change and would tend to quiet the person. Swamiji would win the audience by showing them that this person didn't know what he was talking about, and the person would feel vibrations of room change, that the audience was no longer listening or believing his spiel, and so the person would shut up. So Swamiji would remove the audience rather than person. He would do it without crushing the person. He would do it by superior intelligence, but also with a lot of compassion. When I saw him do these things, then I realized he was a great teacher and a great human being. He had that sensitivity not to injure a person physically or emotionally, so that when the person sat down and shut up, he wouldn't be doing it in defeat or anger. He wouldn't be hurt. He would just be outwitted by the Swami. Even while translating in the privacy of his room, Srila Prabhupada was interrupted by disturbances. Once police car and ambulance, sirens screaming, light flashes converged beneath his window after the Hells Angels had started a fight in the digger's store in the next building. On another occasion, about 1:30 a.m., while Prabhupada was dictating teachings of Lord Chaitanya, a girl repeatedly knocked and called at Prabhupada's door. At first, he ignored the interruption. Since his arrival in San Francisco, he had completed many pages of his important book. Lord Chaitanya's discussions with Rupa Goswami and Sanatana Goswami, Ramananda Roy, and others explored many Krishna conscious topics mentioned only briefly in Bhagavad Gita. In the West, almost no one knew about these teachings of Lord Chaitanya, and now Srila Prabhupada intended to compile these teachings in one volume, providing the most complete presentation of Bhakti Yoga ever introduced in English. Such a book would give great substance to Krishna consciousness movement. But now his solitary concentration was being interrupted by a knocking at a door and a woman's voice calling. Getting up from his desk, Prabhupada went to the front room but did not open the door. Who is there? A young woman answered, I want to speak to you. Come back later in the morning, Prabhupada told her. He knew that in San Francisco, just as in New York, he would not always be able to write peacefully. Preaching in America meant having to tolerate just this, a crazy call in the middle of night, tearing one away from ecstatic concentration on the pastimes of Lord Chaitanya. The lost souls of Head Ashbury, with their illusions of knowledge, their cries for help, their ignorant challenges, pulled his attention away from his mission of translating and commenting on the scriptures. Now, alone in his apartment, speaking through the locked door, Prabhupada told his intruder that he had work to do and that she should go away. He promised he would see her later that day. He was ready to speak with the hippies all day, but the early morning hours were the special time for his literary work. Preaching face to face to the conditioned souls was important. He had come here to preach, but he had picked these early hours to speak intimately to the whole world through his books without disturbance. The girl, however, continued pounding and calling until Prabhupada finally opened the door. There, standing in the hallway, he saw a teenage hippie with a glassy stare and deranged appearance. He asked her what she wanted. She remained tensely silent. Speak, he told her. She stepped into his room. He saw her helpless, a victim in the ocean of Maya, and he asked her repeatedly what she wanted. Finally, the girl stared at him with widened eyes and exclaimed, Look, Mahaula. Prabhupada decided to awaken Mukunda, who lived down the hall. He stepped barefoot into the hallway. The girl followed, shutting the self-locking door behind her. Now he was locked out of his apartment. She continued to stare at him defiantly in the bare, unfriendly surrounding of a corridor of locked doors at 1 in the morning. This was why the Babajis of Vrindavan stayed in their little cottages chanting the holy name to avoid being bothered by ungodly persons. The Babajis, of course, never even dreamed of these bizarre intrusions from the psychedelic San Francisco night. At Mukunda's door, Prabhupada began pounding and calling loudly, Mukunda, 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 awoke and opened the door, astonished to see his spiritual master standing barefoot in the hallway, a wild-eyed young girl standing a few feet behind. Yet Prabhupada remained grave and aloof. This girl came to my door, he began. He explained briefly what has happened and what should now be done. He did not appear angry or harassed by the girl, and he indicated that Mukunda should deal kindly with her. Mukunda remembered when Prabhupada had been driven out of his New York Beverly loft by his roommate David Allen, who had gone mad on LSD. Then also, Prabhupada had remained cool-headed, though caught by a dangerous and awkward circumstance. Mukunda went downstairs and awoke Hayagriva, who had a key to Prabhupada's apartment. Srila Prabhupada then returned to his room and to his dictation of teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Mukunda saw the girl down to the street and admonished her not to bother an elderly gentleman like the Swami at such an hour. Staring at Mukunda, she said, You are not ready, and walked away. At 7 o'clock, when Prabhupada came down to the temple for the morning class, the girl was sitting in the audience in a calmer state of mind. She apologized. Later in the day, Prabhupada repeated the story in the good humor, recounting how he had several times asked the girl to speak. He opened his eyes wide, imitating her expression, and said, Look, Mahaula, and laughed. We shall go for a walk at 6:30, Srila Prabhupada said one morning. You can drive me to the park. Several devotees accompanied him to Golden Gate Park's Stove Lake. They knew the park well and led Srila Prabhupada on a scenic walk around the lake, over a bridge through forest enclosed path, and across a small rivulet, hoping to please him with nature's beauty. As he walked, striding quickly, he could point to a tree or stop to examine a flower. What is this tree? He would ask. What is this flower? Although his disciples were usually at a loss to answer. When Chaitanya Mahaprabhu passed through the forest of Vrindavan, he said, all the plants, trees, and creepers were delighted to see him and rejoiced in his presence. The plant life there is like that in the spiritual sky, fully conscious. And these trees, Swamiji, how consciousness are they? Oh, the spirit soul is there, Srila Prabhupada said, but the consciousness has been arrested temporarily. Perception is more limited. Whatever Prabhupada saw, he saw through the eyes of scripture, and his comments on the most ordinary things were full of transcendental instruction. As he walked, he reflected aloud. Those who want to see God must first have the qualification to see the God. They must be purified. Just like the cloud is now covering the sun, they say, Oh, the sun is not out. But the sun is there, only our eyes are covered. Like like tour guides, the boys led Prabhupada to more picturesque areas. They came upon swans gliding on the lake. Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada said, compares devotees to swans and literature about Lord Krishna to beautiful, clear lakes. The non-devotees, he said, were like crows, attracted by the rubbish of mundane topics. Walking over a gravel path, he stopped and drew their attention. Look at the pebbles. As many pebbles there are that many universes, and in each universe there are innumerable living entities. The devotees delighted in bringing Swamiji to Rhododendron Glen, its big bushes completely covered with white and pink flowers, and they felt privileged to see Krishna through Swamiji's eyes. The next morning, when Prabhupada again wanted to go to the park, more devotees accompanied him. They had heard from the others how Swamiji had displayed a different mood while walking. Again, the boys were ready to lead him along new trails around the lake, but without announcing a change in plans. He walked up and down the macadam road beside the lake. Prabhupada and his followers came up a flock of sleeping ducks. Awakened by the sound of the people walking on the path, the ducks began quacking, moving their wings, walking away. When a few devotees hurried ahead to shoo the ducks from Prabhupada's path, the ducks began making sounds of grouching and grumbling. Move, you ducks, one devotee said. You are disturbing Swamiji. Prabhupada said quietly, as we are thinking they are disturbing us, they are thinking we are disturbing them. Prabhupada stopped beneath a large tree and pointed to some bird droppings on the ground. What does this mean? He asked, turning to a new boy who stood beside him. Prabhupada's face was serious. The boy blushed. I, hmm, I don't know what it means. Prabhupada remained thoughtful, waiting for an explanation. The devotees gathered around him, looking intently down at the bird droppings. The boy thought the Swami might be expecting him to decipher some hidden meaning in the pattern of the droppings, the way people read the future in tea leaves. He felt he should say something. It's the excreta, the defecation of the bird. Prabhupada smiled and turned toward others for an answer. They were silent. It means, said Prabhupada, that these birds, he pronounced the words birds, have lived in the same tree for more than 2 weeks. He laughed. Even the birds are attached to their apartments. As they passed the shuffleboard courts and old men playing checkers, Prabhupada stopped and turned to the boys. Just see, he said, old people in this country do not know what to do, so they play like children, wasting their last days, which should be meant for developing Krishna consciousness. Their children are growing and gone away, so this is a natural time for spiritual cultivation. But no, they get some cat or dog, and instead of serving God, they serve dog. It is most unfortunate, but they will not listen. Their ways are set, therefore we are speaking to youth who are searching. When Prabhupada and the boys passed a sloping green lawn just off Khezar Drive, the boys pointed out that this was the famous Hippies Hill. In the early morning, the gently sloping hill and the big quiet meadow, surrounded by eucalyptuses and oaks, were silent and still. But in a few hours, hundreds of hippies would gather here to launch on the grass, meet friends, and get high. Prabhupada advised the boys to come here and hold kirtans. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Prabhuji.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Thank you,
Krishna.
Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Hare
Thank you,
Krishna.
Prabhuji.
पञ्चकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपासिन्धुभ्येव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय हिज होलीनेस सतस्वरूप गोस्वामी महाराज की जय हरे कृष्ण
Hare Krishna.
Hare
Thank you,
Krishna.
Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.